A brutal winter storm was raging across the ridgelines of Denali National Park when Gabe Sullivan found himself hopelessly lost in a swirl of white. Visibility was near zero, and the howling wind drowned out even his own cries for help. As he stumbled through knee-deep drifts, frost creeping beneath his layers, he felt the creeping shadow of despair. Yet in that darkest moment, something unexpected happened. A powerful shape emerged from the swirling snow, and Gabe discovered he was not alone. In a single extraordinary act, a wild bear became his lifeline. Little did Gabe know, this was only the beginning of a bond that would change his life forever. Gabe Sullivan had always considered himself a competent outdoorsman. Born and raised in Fairbanks, Alaska, he grew up fishing in icy creeks and trekking on glacier-fed trails. After 29 winters, he was no stranger to snowstorms, but nothing in his experience prepared him for the sudden fury of the blizzard that swallowed him whole in Denali National Park. He'd set out in late November on what was supposed to be a quick, invigorating weekend hike along the Savage River Loop. The forecast mentioned mild snowfall, not a full-scale tempest. Feeling confident, Gabe packed only minimal gear, a lightweight tent, a day's worth of rations, and extra layers. Early in the morning, he started up the trail that wound through thin clusters of black spruce and then ascended to open tundra. Hours later, the weather turned. The wind whipped across the plains, carrying walls of snow so thick he could hardly see his own boots. Gabe cursed under his breath. He'd grown too complacent, trusting in an overly optimistic forecast. Battling the gusts, he searched for landmarks, a distinctive ridge, a boulder formation, anything. Instead, the world dissolved into a blur of white. To conserve energy, he tried to settle in a semi-sheltered hollow near the foot of Mount Margaret, just off the popular park road. But the wind stung like needles and threatened to bury his tent in drifting snow. Each attempt to pitch a windbreak or start a fire ended in frustration. The temperature plummeted. The swirling ice crystals scoured his cheeks, leaving them raw and numb. His legs trembled from exertion. His gloved hands, stiff with cold, struggled to manipulate the tent poles. The storm screamed overhead, swallowing up his every panting breath. Panic chewed at the edges of his mind. He thought of his mother's worried face back in Fairbanks, his father's lessons about always over-preparing. "I messed up," he admitted silently, a deep pit forming in his stomach. "I messed up bad." In a desperate move, he tried to trudge lower along a ravine, hoping to find a patch of trees. Each step took monumental effort, and his footprints vanished behind him almost instantly. A sense of doom welled within him as the sky darkened and the wind howled its relentless fury. This wasn't just an average winter squall. It felt like nature's wrath made manifest. Gabe's vision blurred, exhaustion sapped his will, and a dreamlike numbness crept over him. Then, just when he thought he couldn't take another step, something large and dark loomed in his peripheral vision, an outline in the gale. He blinked, uncertain if frostbite was robbing him of his senses. The shape moved, massive and deliberate, a living presence. His heart jumped. A bear? Fear warred with disbelief. Yet as it drew closer, he realized it wasn't charging him. Instead, it stopped a few yards away, as if curious or concerned. Gabe could do nothing but stare, heart pounding in his ears, barely able to breathe. In the swirling blizzard, man and bear locked eyes across the wildest realm Alaska could conjure. Under normal circumstances, a bear's appearance in winter would be an alarming anomaly. Most grizzlies or black bears in the Denali region would have begun denning or at least prepared for hibernation. But here it stood, a creature with dense fur caked in frost, rivulets of snow trailing off its broad back. Gabe's instincts screamed danger, but his exhaustion ran deeper than fear. He tried to edge backward, but the snowdrift behind him gave way, and he slipped onto one knee. Searing cold shot up his body, and his vision blurred with fatigue. The bear made a low, rumbling noise, less a growl, more a curious chuff. It padded closer, within a half-dozen feet, black eyes intense, but not overtly hostile. "Is this real?" Gabe wondered. The wind shrieked around them, as if furious at this break in the storm's lethal narrative. Gabe's teeth chattered uncontrollably. He was faint, toes stinging with possible frostbite. Still, he couldn't stop staring at the beast, whose breath formed steaming clouds in the freezing air. Then, in an act that defied every wilderness safety rule or rational fear, Gabe reached out a trembling hand, as though hoping for a miracle. The bear didn't recoil. Instead, it sniffed the air, closing the gap between them. Its massive shoulder, broad as a steel barrel, blocked some of the wind. Gabe sensed an inexplicable comfort radiating from the creature's presence. A wave of dizziness washed over him. His body, starved for warmth, threatened to shut down. He had to do something, anything, to keep consciousness. Summoning what remained of his strength, Gabe fumbled in his backpack for a spare wool blanket. He managed to drape it across his own shoulders, but the wind threatened to rip it away. The bear edged closer, almost pressing against him, a living windbreak of fur and muscle. Gabe felt hot tears sting his eyes, though they froze quickly on his lashes. It made no sense. The typical reaction of a wild bear would be caution at best, aggression at worst. But in that moment, it stood as if sheltering him from the worst of the gale. Minutes bled into hours. Gabe wasn't sure anymore. His mind wavered between delirium and tenuous awareness. The swirling snow around them formed a swirling vortex of ice and shadow, and the world reduced to the sound of the storm and the living warmth beside him. Occasionally, the bear huffed or shifted, nearly knocking him off balance, but never left him to the raging elements. In a half-awake daze, Gabe leaned into the beast's flank, drawing faint warmth from its thick coat. His lips were cracked, throat raw from the frigid wind. He had no idea how long the storm would last, whether rescue was even possible, or if dawn would ever come. Yet somehow, he clung to life thanks to this mysterious savior. Eventually, exhaustion claimed him. Darkness swam at the edges of his vision, and he slumped, losing track of time and place. The last thing he remembered was the sensation of coarse fur and the steady rhythm of an animal's breathing amid the howling wind. Sunlight, weak but unmistakable, pierced Gabe's eyelids as he came to. He was lying on a bed of packed snow near a natural overhang of rock, a formation that offered partial protection from the wind. Pain radiated through his fingers and toes, each throb a reminder of how close he'd come to hypothermia. He tried moving them, relief flooding him to find they still responded. Barely. With a groan, he propped himself up. To his astonishment, the storm had passed. The sky above was a crisp, pale blue. Drifts of snow shimmered in the morning light, revealing the savage beauty of the landscape. Memories of the night before rushed in the swirling gale, the suffocating cold, and above all, the bear. He looked around in a panic. There was no sign of the massive animal. Only a single, broad paw print remained visible near the ledge, half filled with fresh powder. Could it have been real? He questioned, still groggy. The possibility of hallucination gnawed at him. Perhaps in his delirium he had invented a guardian that didn't exist. Yet the print suggested otherwise, and so did the faint odor of musk lingering in the air. Amid the hush, Gabe examined his surroundings. The rocky outcrop extended a few yards, forming a rough, shallow cave. He was certain that, in the midst of the storm, he hadn't been able to see it clearly. Maybe the bear had led him or guided him here somehow. He had no recollection of walking under the overhang on his own. He checked his pack. His phone was completely dead, no surprise, given the cold. His lighter and half his rations were still intact. The joy of small victories rose in his chest. He still had some food. He quickly stuffed a protein bar into his mouth, barely tasting it as hunger compelled him. After eating, he gathered enough loose twigs and brush from under the rocky shelf to build a tiny fire. It took several attempts with numb fingers, but finally the spark caught. The meager flames offered a little comfort. Gabe let himself breathe more steadily as warmth seeped into his aching muscles. Then his mind turned to survival. He was still miles from any ranger station, and the snowfall had obscured trails. I need to get moving. If I stay here, I might survive another night, but rescue won't magically come. He brushed away the lingering sense of gratitude or guilt he felt about the bear. Part of him wanted to remain, just in case it returned, but logic insisted he had to reach civilization, or at least find higher ground for a cell signal. He scooped up handfuls of snow to melt in his mouth, checking each for debris. The cold water soothed his parched throat. Then he packed up, layering on every bit of clothing he had left. Just before extinguishing the fire, he cast a final glance at the enormous paw print in the snow. A twinge of awe caught him off guard. Why did it help me, he wondered. Animals weren't usually altruistic. Yet something profound had occurred, bridging a gap between species. He extinguished the flames and stepped out from under the overhang, determined to press on. The morning air felt sharp but bearable, and the sky offered the promise of a calm day ahead. Still, the memory of the bear's gentle warmth lingered like a half-remembered dream, giving him a flicker of hope he sorely needed. Snow crunched beneath Gabe's boots as he began trudging through the pristine white expanse. He kept glancing at his compass, a battered old relic passed down from his grandfather, just to maintain a sense of direction. The trek was arduous. Every step felt like wading through thick sand, and his limbs were still stiff from the night's cold. Yet adrenaline and the remnants of fear spurred him onward. To his surprise, not far from the overhang, he spotted a series of enormous footprints leading away. The prints were deep, spaced apart by an animal with a massive stride, the bear's tracks. A rush of mixed emotions surged within him, gratitude, curiosity, and a bizarre sense of loss. He felt drawn to follow them, even though his rational mind whispered that it was unwise to chase a wild animal in these conditions. Yet something about the footprints compelled him. Perhaps it was the irrepressible need for closure, to confirm he hadn't imagined the entire encounter. The snow was fresh, and the paw prints, though partially drifted, were still discernible. Each step reminded him that he owed his life to this mysterious creature. He found himself skirting the edge of a ravine, the tracks weaving in and out of partially buried shrubs. Occasionally, he'd pause to marvel at how the bear had navigated the terrain with such ease in the storm. Gabe, on the other hand, slipped more than once, landing awkwardly on a patch of ice. Each tumble sent jolts of pain through his battered joints, a reminder of his precarious physical state. Eventually, the tracks led him onto a narrow plateau overlooking a vast, silent valley. The wind here was gentler, but the temperature remained brutally low. Gabe realized he was venturing farther from the main routes hikers typically used. If he was going to be rescued, it wouldn't be out here in the wilderness. He took a long moment to scan the horizon. Endless peaks glimmered, ridges jagged under the winter sun, and not a single wisp of smoke or sign of human life. A pang of isolation tugged at his chest. Then he remembered the wise words from his father's lessons in survival. Never forget your priorities: warmth, shelter, water, and a plan. He had to ask himself, is following these tracks part of a plan, or am I letting emotion rule me? Sighing, he knew the answer. With reluctance, he tore his gaze away from the footprints, leading deeper into the wilderness. Turning his back on them felt like abandoning a spiritual quest, but continuing might doom him. He needed to reorient. Checking his compass, he pinpointed a route that should lead him downhill toward the Teklanika River area, where a ranger station might be found, or at least a known trail. Before he left, he took a photo of one of the clearest paw prints in the snow, an imprint that dwarfed his own boot in comparison. The camera click sounded small in the vast emptiness. It would serve as tangible proof of the bear's existence, a relic of a night he still struggled to comprehend. Gabe took one last, lingering look at the winding path of prints. A sense of connection flared in his chest, a silent farewell to the animal that had saved his life. Then he tore himself away, forging toward the direction of potential safety, each step heavy but determined. Gabe Sullivan spent the next 48 hours in a blurry haze of relief, pain, and flickers of gratitude. He could hardly put into words. His rescuers Rick Carter, Andrea Montero, and George Dixon were a research team lodging in a small backcountry cabin. They hadn't anticipated guests, least of all a half-frozen hiker fresh from a near-death encounter in the Denali wilderness. Yet from the moment Gabe stumbled through their doorway, they treated him like family, pressing warm blankets around his shoulders and guiding him closer to the roaring wood stove that stood in the center of the one-room structure. The cabin itself was humble but surprisingly well stocked. A sturdy table littered with charts and notebooks hinted at the trio's scientific pursuits, wildlife tracks, predation patterns, vegetation surveys. Shelves sagged with canned goods and medical supplies, while sleeping bags were rolled neatly against one wall. At the far end, 2 cots had been shoved together to make space for Gabe's makeshift bed. The lingering sense of coffee grounds, camp stew, and wood smoke reminded him of simpler times, almost like a childhood camping trip. If not for the throb of frostbitten fingers and the weariness that weighed on his bones. When he first sank into the blankets, the warmth was both a blessing and a shock. His nerve endings had gone numb in the storm, and now they tingled with painful pins and needles as circulation returned. Andrea, who had some emergency medical training, examined his hands and feet by the glow of a lantern. Her brow creased with concern. "You're lucky," she said softly, applying antibiotic cream and wrapping his fingers in gauze. No blackened tissue so far, just early frostbite. Keep these warm and dry, or you risk infection. Rick and George hovered nearby, anxious but respectful. They asked question after question about his ordeal. How did you get lost? How bad was the storm? And finally, did you really see a bear in the middle of a blizzard? The 3 of them exchanged astonished looks when Gabe described the silent approach of the hulking shape and how it had sheltered him from the wind. "I've heard legends of animals helping humans," George mused, stroking a short beard flecked with grey, "but I never believed it could be real." "It's possible the bear was disoriented by the storm," Andrea speculated, "or even curious. But to stand guard like that's extraordinary." Gabe could only nod, still grappling with the memory. Sometimes, when he recounted it, the whole thing felt impossibly surreal, like a fever dream conjured by desperation. Yet the paw print he'd seen at dawn, half filled with new fallen snow, was undeniable proof. He hadn't imagined it. The recollection sent a shiver through him, a confusion of awe and an odd pang of guilt, as though he owed a debt he could never repay. For the next 2 days, they insisted he rest. Andrea changed his bandages morning and night, while Rick prepared hearty meals of canned soup supplemented by rice, beans, and the occasional treat, dried salmon or dehydrated vegetables. George, ever curious, encouraged Gabe to share every detail he could remember, scribbling notes in a dog-eared field journal. He seemed fascinated by the possibility of unusual bear behavior and even speculated about whether the animal might have been out of its den early or never fully hibernated. Outside, the world remained cold but calmer. Occasional gusts rattled the cabin walls, and snow draped the forest in winter's hush. At night, the wind still howled across the open tundra, but it no longer felt like a life-threatening monster. Gabe listened to it while cocooned in blankets, recalling how the gale had battered him and how the bear's broad flank had seemed to block the worst of it. Sometimes, in the flickering light of the lantern, he caught himself wiping away tears he couldn't fully explain. Gratitude and lingering fear danced in his mind, a constant reminder that he'd come perilously close to not being alive at all. By the third morning, Gabe felt a cautious stir of energy. He managed to walk around the cabin without wobbling too much, and the sharp ache in his toes subsided to a dull throb. That was when Rick proposed a plan. "We've got 2 snowmobiles. I can take you to the ranger station near the Teclanica River crossing. From there, they can either fly you out or arrange transport. You'll need a proper medical check, probably in Fairbanks." Gabe agreed, though anxiety bubbled in his chest at the thought of venturing back into the snowbound world, even if only for a short ride. Before leaving, Andrea double-checked his bandages and pressed a thermos of hot tea into his hands. "Finish this before you go. Keep warm," she urged, her voice kind but firm. George clasped Gabe's shoulder, wishing him well, his eyes still bright with the allure of such an astonishing survival tale. It took nearly half an hour to pack the snowmobile with Gabe's gear. He donned a spare set of gloves, from Rick heavier, thicker, a layer of extra protection. His own battered gloves lacked. As they stepped out, the cold air hit Gabe's lungs like a slap, but the sky was shockingly clear, a fragile eggshell blue that hinted at better weather ahead. The snowmobile ride itself was both exhilarating and nerve-wracking. The machine roared through drifts, bouncing over hidden ridges. Each jolt sent twinges through Gabe's battered limbs, but the novelty of traveling quickly across a landscape that had nearly killed him felt surreal. The world stretched out in dazzling whites and muted greys, mountains looming on the horizon. Occasionally, Rick slowed to check the GPS, ensuring they stayed on course. Gabe clung to the handlebars, marveling at the sudden shift from near-death isolation to a swift, mechanical exodus towards safety. After about 2 hours, they arrived at the ranger station, a modest outpost nestled among pines. It looked cozy compared to the blank expanse around it, with smoke curling from a stovepipe. Gabe dismounted on unsteady legs. Rick helped carry his pack to the station's entrance, then offered a bear hug goodbye, refusing to accept more than a quiet thank you. Gabe watched as Rick revved the snowmobile's engine and headed back toward the cabin, the noise receding into the hush of the forest. Inside, Ranger Sarah Fong, the same official who'd later logged Gabe's unusual story, sat behind a small desk cluttered with radio equipment. She raised her brows in recognition when Rick introduced Gabe, then bustled into a flurry of questions: name, date of birth, details of the incident. Gabe repeated his harrowing account, mindful of how improbable it sounded. Sarah took notes diligently, glancing up every so often with a mix of skepticism and empathy. When he mentioned the bear's intervention, Sarah paused, pen hovering above the page. "That's unusual," she said carefully, "but Denali has a way of surprising even seasoned rangers. I'm just glad you made it out." Gabe underwent a rudimentary medical evaluation at the station's tiny infirmary. The nurse, an older woman named June, examined his bandages and nodded approval at Andrea's handiwork. "You'll want a hospital checkup soon," June advised, "but I've seen worse. You're one lucky young man." Luck, the word sat heavily in Gabe's mind. If chance alone had saved him, why did it come in the form of a bear's warmth? Even as exhaustion pulled at him, he knew the experience was more than random good fortune. Something profound had transpired out there. By late afternoon, a supply truck arrived en route to Fairbanks, and the driver agreed to take on a passenger. Before leaving, Gabe shook Ranger Fong's hand, managing a weak smile. She squeezed his shoulder in a rare show of warmth. "Heal up, and if you remember anything else about that bear, let us know." He climbed into the truck's cab, stowing his backpack at his feet. As they rumbled away from the outpost, each mile felt surreal, an abrupt return to the world of ploughed roads and the faint hum of radio chatter. The driver, a quiet man with a thick jacket, shot him curious glances but didn't pry. Gabe stared out the window, half listening to the rumble of the engine, half lost in memory. The nearer they got to Fairbanks, the clearer it became that he was leaving behind more than just a patch of Alaskan wilderness. He was leaving behind the single most profound encounter of his life, one that challenged every assumption he had about the natural order. A second chance, he thought, kneading his bandaged fingers. "I owe my life to that bear and to the kindness of strangers who found me in time." Night descended, and distant city lights glowed on the horizon. Gabe leaned against the cold glass, letting fatigue consume him. Tomorrow he'd resume a semblance of ordinary life, but he felt forever changed. An unwritten debt weighed on him like an unspoken vow. Someday I have to go back. Whether to see the bear, to thank it, or simply to confront the mystery, he couldn't be sure. Yet the need pulsed within him like a heartbeat, echoing the warmth that had once shielded him from a howling storm. With the help of Rick, Andrea, and George, Gabe spent a couple of days recuperating in the cozy cabin. They were a group of wildlife enthusiasts who'd come to the park for an extended research trip, gathering data on wolfpack territories and winter bird behaviors. Surprised as they were by his presence, they welcomed Gabe without hesitation, sharing their supplies and a small bunk. Each day, Gabe checked the mirror in the cabin's bedroom to see how his frostbitten fingertips were healing. The damage was real, but far less severe than it could have been. Doctor visits would still be necessary once he returned to civilization, but at least it wasn't dire. He made sure to keep his hands and feet warm, changing bandages and applying ointments from Andrea's well-stocked medical kit. Between their own tasks, his new friends pressed him for details about the bear. Each time he recounted the story, Gabe felt the same mixture of wonder and disbelief. He played them the short audio note he'd recorded on his phone right before the battery had died, a snippet of wind, his own labored breathing, and a faint chuffing sound that could have been the bear. The group listened in rapt silence, exchanging looks. On the third morning, the weather improved, and Rick offered to drive Gabe out toward the main park road on a snowmobile. They parted ways with Andrea and George, who remained behind to continue their research. The ride was bumpy, exhilarating even, as they sped across snowfields and frozen creek beds. Though the cold air stung Gabe's cheeks, he welcomed the sense of momentum after days of convalescence. They reached the ranger station before noon, where Gabe gave a brief statement about his ordeal to the on-duty ranger, a no-nonsense woman named Sarah Fong. She raised her brows when he mentioned the bear but didn't dismiss it outright. "This park's seen plenty of strange encounters," she conceded, jotting notes in a logbook. "If you see it again, or if it approaches others, let us know." A standard medical check followed at the station's small infirmary. The nurse recommended Gabe get further care once he returned to Fairbanks. After a few polite goodbyes, Rick rode off, leaving Gabe to plan his exit from the park. By late afternoon, he managed to hitch a ride on a supply truck heading out of Denali, the driver kindly offering him a seat. All the while, a quiet sense of displacement settled over him. The transition back to normal life felt surreal. As the truck rumbled along the cleared highway, distant peaks glowed under a pale winter sun. Gabe found his eyes drawn again and again to the wilderness, half expecting to glimpse a lone figure with a thick coat of fur. "You saved me once," he thought, imagining a silent conversation with the bear. I wonder if you're real, or if I've just turned you into a legend in my mind." Despite his attempts at logic, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd experienced something extraordinary, a brush with nature's capacity for empathy, or at least a cosmic twist that defied explanation. Back in Fairbanks, Gabe struggled to readjust. Friends who heard about his survival story offered everything from celebratory dinners to cautionary lectures about winter hiking. His mother, teary-eyed and furious by turns, insisted he never again venture into the wild unprepared. Meanwhile, local news outlets briefly covered his ordeal, a human interest piece on the miracle rescue in Denali. Gabe kept the bear's role vague, uncertain how the public would respond to a tale of near-mythical altruism from a wild predator. He visited a clinic for his frostbite. The doctor warned him that numbness might persist for a few months, but he was fortunate to have avoided serious tissue damage. As he dressed each finger carefully, Gabe couldn't help remembering how the bear's body heat that night in the storm had been more effective than any glove or blanket. Time slipped by in a blur of obligations, his job at a local outdoor gear shop, familial responsibilities, and dinner invitations. Yet, the call of the wilderness still tugged at him. He caught himself staring out windows, daydreaming about snow-capped mountains, the hush of pine forests, and the primal silence where he had nearly lost his life. The memory of the bear haunted him like an unfinished chapter. Eager for a sense of closure, he revisited the photo of the paw print on his phone. It filled the screen, dwarfing his footprints beside it. Sometimes he zoomed in, studying the ridges and contours as if searching for a hidden message. A part of him wondered if returning to Denali was wise. Another part felt an almost sacred duty to see if the bear was real or a singular fever dream. At night, his dreams wove images of swirling snowstorms and the faint warmth of a massive shoulder pressed against him. He'd wake with a jolt, heart racing, the phantom roar of the wind echoing in his ears. On one occasion, he dreamt of the bear standing at the edge of his backyard in Fairbanks. As if beckoning him, the dream left him unsettled but also oddly comforted. Eventually, the snows began to recede, and March sunlight brought longer days. Tourists started booking summer trips to Denali. The world was moving on, following the cyclical rhythm of seasons. But Gabe still felt the pull of that hidden realm beyond the well-trodden trails. One evening, as he closed the store where he worked, he felt a nudge from fate. A customer had shared a rumor of an unusual bear sighted near Wonder Lake, uncharacteristically unafraid of people. The traveler had no photos, just a second-hand account of a ranger who saw a large, solitary bear in early spring. Gabe's pulse quickened. Could it be the same one? He lingered in the shop long after closing, lost in thought. The fear and wonder of his experience churned within him. He wasn't sure if seeking out the bear was foolish or necessary. But an undeniable truth stirred in his heart. Some connections, forged in life or death moments, defy reason and linger until answered. By early April, Gabe had made up his mind. He would return to Denali. He told few people of his plan. His mother disapproved wholeheartedly, but he reassured her he'd only be visiting established trails and possibly coordinating with rangers. Privately, he knew he might push deeper into the park if he found evidence of the bear's presence. He prepared meticulously, determined not to repeat past mistakes. His backpack brimmed with emergency supplies, a 4-season sleeping bag, a high-quality tent, a portable stove, extra fuel canisters, first aid gear, satellite communicator, and enough rations to last a week or more. Each item felt like a talisman against the memory of that blizzard. Driving his pickup truck from Fairbanks to Denali's outskirts, he watched spring's tentative arrival. Patches of grass peeked through the snow at lower elevations, and rivulets of meltwater meandered beside the road. The air still held a chill, but it lacked the life-threatening bite of deep winter. Maybe I'll see new life in the park, caribou calves, migrating birds, he mused, a bit of hope lighting his heart. At the entrance, he checked in with Ranger Sarah Fong, the same no-nonsense woman who'd taken his statement months ago. She arched an eyebrow upon recognizing him. "Back so soon?" she asked, scanning his gear. When he inquired about any reported sightings of a large bear acting oddly friendly, she just shrugged. "We get sightings all the time. Bears emerging from dens can be unpredictable. I wouldn't put too much stock in rumors." Yet, she didn't forbid him from going. Instead, she outlined safety reminders, and he promised to update her on his whereabouts via the park's dispatch line if he ventured off common routes. She also insisted he carry bear spray and flares, just in case your friendly bear decides to act like a real bear. Gabe drove further, then parked at a ranger-monitored lot near the Teclanica River crossing. From there, he planned to hike deeper into the park, possibly retracing some of his route from the ill-fated winter journey, but in far safer weather. Glistening ice still crusted parts of the river, but the flow had increased, and the banks revealed pockets of thawed mud. Setting out on foot felt almost ceremonial. Each step awakened memories of the harrowing storm and the improbable rescue. He made steady progress along a maintained trail, passing through stands of spruce and open meadows. Afternoon sunlight cut through the chill, shimmering over the snow in fleeting patterns. Now and then, he paused to scan the surroundings, half expecting a towering shape to materialize. He encountered a few other hikers along the way, nature enthusiasts hoping to catch early glimpses of Denali's famed wildlife. But none had any remarkable bear stories. A pang of disappointment mingled with relief. Maybe the bear was just that, a ghost in the winter, an angel in fur who'd done its part and vanished. Yet Gabe pressed on, brimming with a quiet determination. If the bear was still out there, he wanted to be the one who found it. Not to chain or capture it, but simply to bear witness to confirm that in a landscape built on survival, an unexpected moment of kindness had indeed bridged the gulf between man and beast. 2 days into his trek, Gabe set up a small campsite beside a partially thawed creek, a safe distance from the main trail. The nights were cold, but nothing like the lethal freeze he experienced before. This time, he had a reliable tent and a well-sealed sleeping bag, plus a small camp stove that hissed comfortingly when he boiled water for instant noodles. He maintained a daily routine, hike methodically, explore side paths, and scan for tracks or signs of bear activity. Tracks were plentiful. The region was home to many bears. After all, but most seemed older, weathered by melt and refreeze cycles. Occasionally, he found fresh scat or claw marks on trees, sending his pulse racing with the possibility that his bear roamed nearby. As he moved deeper, the terrain grew wilder. Ragged ridges cut across the horizon, and swirling clouds clung to distant peaks. The hush of the wind through young buds on the trees gave him a sense of renewal. Even as solitude pressed in, he felt oddly at peace. At times, he thought he caught a fleeting whiff of musk on the breeze, a smell that dredged up the memory of fur and warmth during the storm. Midway through the 3rd day, he climbed a gentle slope, leading to a low plateau. The snow underfoot was patchy, revealing brown grass and lichen beneath. Near the top, he froze, a fresh paw print, large, deep, and unmistakably ursine. His heart hammered. He crouched, comparing the spread to his memory. It matched the general size of a full-grown adult bear, possibly bigger. The edges were crisp, suggesting it had been made within the last day or two. A line of prints led away from the plateau, weaving between stunted pines. He followed cautiously, adrenaline spiking with each step. The path eventually diverged, blending with older tracks, but the sense of the bear's presence felt stronger than ever. He paused to calm his nerves, reminding himself that any bear he encountered might not be the same one, and it could be dangerous. He patted the can of bear spray clipped to his belt, trying to quell an undercurrent of fear. As twilight approached, he decided to make camp. He chose a site near a small stand of trees, carefully storing his food in a bear-proof container far from the tent. Despite his safety measures, excitement lit up his thoughts. What if I see it at dawn? Or maybe it's watching me now. That night, he lay awake, the hush of Denali enveloping him. The half-moon cast silver beams across the ground, turning patches of snow into pale mirrors. Sleep eluded him. Instead, his mind replayed the night of the storm, the moment he first saw that massive shape emerge from the snow. He realized how much he yearned for a reunion, an impossible, wondrous chance to confirm that compassion thrived even among predators. At some point, exhaustion took him. Outside, the wind murmured secrets among the trees. Unbeknownst to him, a quiet presence moved at the edges of his campsite, leaving faint tracks that no one but dawn's light would reveal. Sunlight threaded through Gabe's tent at daybreak, rousing him from a fitful sleep. He emerged, stretching stiff limbs, and immediately noticed a single large paw print near a patch of newly melted snow about 20 yards from his tent. Heart pounding, he crouched to inspect it. The track was fresh, edges still firm, definitely made sometime during the night. A shiver raced up his spine. Had the bear been watching him as he slept? Fueled by a strange mixture of apprehension and elation, he struck camp quickly. If the bear was indeed close by, he wanted to keep moving, see if he could spot it. A gentle breeze rustled the pines, and the morning air carried the tang of thawed earth. With every step, Gabe's senses felt razor-sharp. He scanned every ridgeline, listened for snapping twigs or heavy footfalls. He followed the tracks as they cut across a low ravine scattered with boulders. Twice, he lost the trail among rocks, only to find it again in a soft patch of damp soil. Eventually, the footprints led him to a narrow canyon where trickles of snowmelt formed a shallow stream. The walls rose steeply on either side, with scraggly shrubs clinging to cracks in the stone. Up ahead, the canyon opened into a small clearing, a natural amphitheater ringed by weather-worn rock. Gabe paused behind a cluster of pines, scanning the clearing for movement. And that's when he saw it, a hulking form, fur dappled by morning light. It stood near the stream's edge, nosing around for something, grubs, roots, or maybe fish lingering in pockets of meltwater. Gabe's breath caught in his throat. The bear's broad shoulders and powerful stance looked achingly familiar. Carefully, he lifted his binoculars to confirm. The creature's dense coat still carried faint patches of lighter fur near its neck. A scar or two cut across its flank thin lines he recognized from the brief glimpses he had during the snowstorm. It's you, he thought, heart thudding. It has to be you. Overcome by emotion, he nearly forgot caution. He took a step forward. The bear's massive head jerked up, black eyes locking onto him. In that moment, all sound seemed to vanish. Man and bear, face to face once more in the Alaskan wild. Fear hammered at Gabe's ribcage. This wasn't a domesticated pet, but an apex predator. Yet, an odd calm also settled over him, as though time rewound to the moment it saved his life in the storm. The bear snorted, its breath curling in the brisk morning air. Gabe exhaled slowly, lifting his hands in a gesture of neutrality, though he doubted the bear recognized such signals. Adrenaline roared in his ears, urging him to flee or fight. But he stayed, trusting a bond formed months ago in the deadliest night of his life. In a span of heartbeats that felt like an eternity, the bear pivoted. For a nerve-wracking second, Gabe thought it might charge. Instead, it loped away, rounding the bend of the stream and disappearing into the canyon walls. Gabe let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, knees trembling with relief and awe. He was sure of it now. This was the very same bear. A swirl of joy, disbelief, and longing churned in his chest. The bear still lived, wandering Denali, and he had come close, so close to it once more. Over the following 2 days, Gabe lingered in the general area where he'd spotted the bear, exploring the winding stream and rocky outcroppings with cautious curiosity. He spotted fresh scat near a patch of new grass and found another paw print embedded in a muddy bank. Each clue fed his resolve. He wanted to see the bear again, but on safer, less abrupt terms, if such a thing was possible. He began leaving small tokens behind, fish scraps and berries placed carefully on flat rocks away from his camp. Not a large quantity. He didn't want to create dependency or coax the bear into dangerous proximity. Instead, he hoped the minimal offering would signal an attempt at mutual respect. Whether the bear understood or even found these morsels, he couldn't be sure. At the same time, Gabe remained vigilant with standard bear safety. He hung his main food supplies high in a tree or stored them in a bear canister, never cooking near his sleeping area. The last thing he wanted was to inadvertently invite a nighttime raid. Each day, he roamed the clearing and the stream valley, scanning for movement. Dusk turned the sky pale violet, shimmering over the snowy peaks. The hush of the wind, broken occasionally by the call of a raven, reminded him how small he was in this vast land. Yet he felt a sense of belonging, as if a hidden thread tied him to Denali's endless wilderness and to the bear that once saved him. Late on the second evening, he sat quietly on a rock near the stream, letting the sun's last rays warm his face. A subtle shift in the air made him glance over his shoulder. There, a dark shape emerged from behind a slope. The bear. A bolt of adrenaline shot through him, but he willed himself to remain calm. The bear approached slowly, stopping about 30 yards away. It sniffed the wind, eyes fixed on Gabe. This time, he felt less fear, more reverence. Slowly, he rose to his feet, heart thumping in his chest. He tried to convey no threat, arms loosely at his sides, posture relaxed but ready to retreat if needed. A profound stillness enveloped them, as though the entire valley held its breath. The bear made a low, chuffing noise, reminiscent of the sound Gabe recalled in the storm. Tentatively, Gabe stepped sideways, putting a few more feet between them, not wanting to crowd the animal's space. The bear huffed again, then ambled closer to the rock, where Gabe had left some berries earlier. He watched in wonder as the bear nosed the offering. Whether out of acceptance or mere hunger, it licked up a few of the berries. Then it turned its gaze back to him, black eyes revealing an intelligence that stilled Gabe's breath. The moment stretched, fragile and surreal. Something in Gabe's chest clenched a rush of gratitude. "Thank you," he wanted to say, as if that single phrase could encompass the night it saved his life. The bear made no sign of understanding, but it seemed at ease, not aggressive. Then, with a measured step, it trotted away, back toward the canyon's shadows. Gabe remained rooted in place, heart soaring and tears threatening to spill. In a harsh world governed by survival, he had glimpsed a fleeting connection that transcended logic. Was it trust, or merely a coincidental calm? Perhaps it didn't matter. The bond existed in that instant, etched forever into Denali's tapestry of man and beast. The next morning, Gabe woke with a renewed sense of purpose. He felt like a man carrying a rare secret, something precious and fragile. Over a mug of coffee brewed on his camp stove, he watched wisps of steam curl against the sunrise. His mind drifted to thoughts of what lay beyond these silent valleys, crowded cities, bustling roads, endless distractions. The stillness of Denali felt more real, more true than any of that. But an unease also gnawed at him. This was still bear country, and the park's unspoken rule reigned supreme. No matter how extraordinary the encounter, wild animals remained dangerous. A single misstep could trigger aggression or set off territorial instincts. Gabe promised himself he would remain cautious, never pushing the boundary too far. He decided to hike further north, following the winding canyon deeper, his instincts telling him the bear might have a den or favored feeding ground there. Conditions were milder than in winter, yet treacherous patches of ice clung to the shadows. He took care with each step, balancing curiosity with the need for safety. Near midday, he spotted the unmistakable shape of a moose carcass, partly buried in snow. Predators had clearly visited tracks of wolves, scavenger birds, and a few large prints that looked fresh. A pang of caution rippled through him. Bears fiercely guard their kills, and if this was the meal that the bear he'd encountered was claiming, stumbling upon it could be disastrous. He circled wide, ensuring he didn't intrude. Just as he was about to move on, an echoing crack reverberated through the valley. Sharp as a gunshot, Gabe froze. Another crack thundered. Hunters? The park had strict rules banning unauthorized hunting, especially for predators. His heart lurched at the possibility that someone could be aiming at the bear. Gritting his teeth, he followed the sound. The terrain rose into a rocky outcrop dotted with scraggly pines. Crouched low, he peered over the ridge and saw a figure in camouflage, rifle raised. Scanning the area, a second figure paced nearby, clearly on edge. Probably a trophy hunt, Gabe's mind screamed. He ducked behind the outcrop, dread tightening his chest. If these people were indeed hunting out of season or targeting bears illegally, the stakes were dire. The memory of the bear's kindness ignited anger in him. He had no authority to confront poachers, yet letting them roam free felt unbearable. He fumbled for his satellite communicator, heart pounding. He typed a quick message to the park rangers describing potential illegal hunting in the region. The communicator beeped, confirming it was sent. Then, carefully, he peered out again. The hunters seemed frustrated, possibly searching for a target that had vanished. An icy realization gripped him. What if the bear had been drawn by these men's earlier gunshots or the leftover moose carcass and walked straight into harm's way? Gabe felt an urgent need to do something, but what could he do without risking his own life? A swirl of emotions hammered at his resolve: fear, anger, and a fierce protective instinct for the creature that had once saved him. He glanced at the communicator, praying the rangers would act swiftly. Until they arrived, though, the bear was in mortal danger. Quietly, Gabe retreated from the ridge, heart hammering in his ears. He had to warn the bear somehow, or at least keep tabs on these poachers until the rangers arrived. Moving in a wide circle, he stayed low, navigating the uneven ground. Occasionally, the crack of a distant rifle shot echoed, each one making him cringe. He prayed the bullets missed their mark, time blurred in the tense cat and mouse. The sun reached its zenith, then began its slow descent, painting the peaks in golden light. Gabe's feet ached from the stealthy pursuit, but adrenaline kept him focused. He spotted the hunters prowling along a ravine. One had a scope, scanning the slopes. The other rummaged in a pack, possibly for more ammo. Suddenly, a commotion erupted from the far side of the ravine. A roar, deep and powerful, reverberated like thunder. Gabe's blood ran cold. He dashed to a vantage point behind boulders. There, across the clearing, he saw his bear looming over the moose carcass. The hunters had discovered it or stumbled upon it. One of them took aim. The bear bellowed, stepping protectively near the kill. This can't end like this, Gabe thought, panic flaring in his chest. Without hesitation, he scrambled down the slope, ignoring the sharp rocks and the possibility of being shot himself. A swirl of raw desperation seized him. The bear had saved his life once. He couldn't stand by and watch it perish. As he neared, one hunter fired. The shot echoed, a bullet glancing off the stones behind the bear. Furious, the beast charged forward, swiping at the air. The second hunter tried to line up another shot, but stumbled over uneven ground. Gabe found himself yelling, though he couldn't recall the words. Maybe he was shouting for them to stop, or maybe he was screaming in sheer terror. Out of nowhere, the thunderous roar of a snowmobile engine cut through the chaos. A pair of park rangers emerged on vehicles, fluorescent jackets glaring against the snowy backdrop. One ranger fired a warning shot into the air, likely a rubber bullet or a flare. The hunters spun, faces twisted in alarm. Realizing they were outmatched, they bolted, dropping gear as they fled. The rangers set off in pursuit, engines whining as they disappeared into the trees. In the sudden stillness, the bear remained near the carcass, panting heavily, eyes wild with fight or flight fury. Gabe stood trembling, halfway between safety and madness. He locked eyes with the bear, breath ragged. 1,000 emotions surged through him: gratitude, terror, relief. If not for the ranger's timely arrival or the bear's formidable presence, blood could have been spilled. The bear flicked its ears, snorted. Gabe instinctively took a step back, every instinct warning him the animal was still on edge. For one suspended moment, it seemed to recognize him. Then, with a final huff, it turned and bounded off, vanishing into the thick brush. A silent wraith of strength and survival. Gabe sank to his knees, chest heaving. Help had come just in time for both of them. When I needed it most, he thought, tears freezing on his cheeks. In its own wild way, the bear had returned to stand with him in a moment of dire need, reaffirming a connection that defied logic. Thank you for journeying with us into the rugged heart of Denali National Park, where one man's life was saved by a bear on a stormy winter night, and where that same bear emerged again in a desperate moment of need. This tale reminds us that even in the harshest realms of nature, unexpected alliances can form, weaving together themes of resilience, trust, and the awe-inspiring power of compassion. If you found yourself moved by Gabe's story and the unwavering spirit of the bear, please like this video to show your support. Share it with friends who might need a reminder that hope can appear in the most unimaginable shapes, at the most crucial times. And don't forget to subscribe for more immersive stories that celebrate the profound bonds humans share with the wild places and wild creatures of our extraordinary planet. Thank you for being part of this adventure, and may you always find courage where you least expect it.